January 17th, 1945. Bastogne, Belgium. The frost had turned the Ardennes forest into a cathedral of ice, each branch encased in crystalline silence. In a makeshift command post carved into frozen earth, surrounded by the 101st Airborne Division, a single radio operator sat hunched over equipment that crackled with German transmissions. His fingers were numb, his breath visible in the subterranean cold. Above him, 600 American paratroopers held a perimeter against 2 German panzer divisions outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded. They had held Bastogne for 32 days. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Medical supplies had run out a week prior. And now, German intelligence had intercepted American communications, confirming what their commanders suspected. The Americans were preparing to surrender. The German 5th Panzer Army was closing in for the final assault, scheduled for dawn. But in those 10 minutes before midnight, one radio operator would transmit a lie so perfectly calibrated, so impossibly bold, that it would rewrite the next 72 hours of the war. The German Wehrmacht had entered the Battle of the Bulge with absolute confidence. Their intelligence reports painted a clear picture. American forces in Bastogne were isolated, depleted, demoralized. Intercepted radio traffic suggested collapse was imminent. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz had already drafted surrender terms, anticipating the Americans would capitulate as they had at St. Vith just days earlier. The mathematical reality supported German assumptions. The 101st Airborne, reinforced by remnants of the 10th Armored Division, numbered approximately 18,000 men at the siege's beginning. After weeks of continuous assault, combat effective strength had fallen below 11,000. German forces surrounding Bastogne exceeded 45,000 troops with armor superiority of 4-1. Artillery ammunition for the Americans averaged 12 rounds per gun per day, barely enough for harassing fire. Food rations had been cut to 1 meal every 2 days. Wounded men lay in makeshift aid stations with no morphine, no plasma, no sulfa drugs. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties by a ratio of 3-1. Every tactical indicator suggested the Americans would break. But American soldiers had learned something the German High Command had not accounted for in their operational calculations. They had learned it in training camps across the United States, where food was so abundant that mess halls threw away more calories each day than German civilians consumed in a week. They had learned it on transport ships crossing the Atlantic, where even enlisted men received coffee, tobacco, and chocolate as standard issue. They had learned it in the supply depots of England, where warehouses stretched for miles containing reserves that seemed inexhaustible. The Americans had internalized a fundamental truth that separated their military from every other fighting force in human history. Their nation possessed resources, so vast that deprivation was temporary. Logistics were destiny, and surrender was never inevitable because relief was always coming. This wasn't optimism. It was mathematical certainty, born from industrial capacity. The United States produced more steel in 1944 than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American factories manufactured 1 aircraft every 5 minutes, 1 tank every 7 minutes, 1 ship every day. Every American soldier knew these numbers, had seen the evidence, had tasted the abundance. They knew their supply lines stretched back to a continent that could not be bombed, could not be blockaded, could not be exhausted. The radio operator's name was Corporal James Hendricks, a 23-year-old from Pennsylvania who had been trained in signals intelligence at Camp Crowder, Missouri. His specific role involved monitoring German communications and, when conditions permitted, feeding false information into enemy networks. Standard doctrine called for subtle deception, small alterations to unit designations, slight modifications to coordinates, minor exaggerations of troop strength. But on this night, with German tanks positioned less than 800 meters from the American perimeter, Hendricks made a decision that violated every principle of conservative intelligence work. He would not transmit a subtle lie. He would transmit an outrageous one. At 11:47 p.m., using captured German encryption codes that American intelligence had broken 3 months prior, Hendricks began broadcasting on German tactical frequencies. His message, transmitted in flawless German with appropriate regional dialect, reported that American reinforcements had broken through German lines from the south. Not a company, not a battalion, an entire armored division. The 4th Armored Division, specifically with full complement, 10,937 men, 263 tanks, 54 self-propelled guns. Expected arrival at Bastogne perimeter, 0600 hours. January 18th. Hendricks included precise details, unit call signs, commander names, movement routes, all fabricated, but consistent with American operational patterns. He repeated the transmission 3 times over 17 minutes, ensuring German signals intelligence would intercept it. The German response was immediate and catastrophic to their own offensive plans. Within 40 minutes, Wehrmacht commanders surrounding Bastogne began receiving orders to reposition forces. The 5th Panzer Army's planned dawn assault was postponed pending reconnaissance. German tanks that had been positioned for final breakthrough attacks were pulled back to defensive positions, anticipating American armor. Artillery batteries that had been zeroed on American lines were redirected to cover southern approach routes. 2 panzer companies were detached entirely and sent south to intercept the phantom American column. The German army, which had been poised to crush the Bastogne garrison with overwhelming force, spent the next 10 hours repositioning 12,000 troops and 200 armored vehicles to counter a threat that did not exist. And in those 10 hours, the weather cleared. American transport aircraft, grounded for 6 days by fog and snow, took off from bases in England and France. By dawn on January 18th, 241 C-47 transport planes arrived over Bastogne, dropping 144 tons of supplies in a single morning. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, fuel. The white parachutes filled the sky like a mechanical snowfall, each canopy carrying proof that the American supply system had not forgotten them, had not abandoned them, was as relentless as mathematics. But the true genius of Hendricks's deception revealed itself not in the immediate tactical confusion it created, but in the psychological impact on German commanders who had been fighting Americans for 3 years across 2 continents. Every German officer who received reports of the phantom 4th Armored Division had memories that made the lie plausible. They remembered Normandy, where American logistics had landed 2.5 million tons of supplies in 90 days. They remembered the Falaise pocket, where American columns had appeared with speed that violated German calculations for mechanized movement. They remembered the pursuit across France, where American armor had advanced 400 miles in 30 days while maintaining full logistical support. The lie worked because it confirmed what German commanders had learned to expect from American operations, that American units appeared when they should not, moved faster than they could, fought longer than logistics should permit. The fundamental asymmetry of the war had become internalized. Germans expected scarcity. Americans expected abundance. And that psychological reality made even the most audacious deception credible. Historical records captured in German archives after the war revealed the precise chain of confusion Hendricks's transmission created. At 12:14 a.m., the German 26th Volksgrenadier Division reported intercepting American communications regarding armored reinforcements. At 12:31 a.m., the report reached the headquarters of General von Luttwitz. At 1:08 a.m., von Luttwitz requested aerial reconnaissance of southern approach routes. At 1:42 a.m., Unable to obtain immediate reconnaissance due to weather, von Lupwitz ordered defensive repositioning as precautionary measure. At 2:15 a.m., the Panzer-Lehr Division received orders to detach forces to southern sector. At 3:33 a.m., German tactical plans for dawn assault on Bastogne were formally postponed for 48 hours, pending clarification of American reinforcement situation. By 6 a.m., when the actual 4th Armored Division was still 72 hours away, fighting through German resistance 30 miles south of Bastogne. The Phantom version of that division had already accomplished its mission. It had bought time, 10 minutes of radio transmission had purchased 72 hours of operational space. The symbolic object that would come to represent this moment was not the radio itself, but the coffee that arrived in those first supply drops. Among the 144 tons of supplies dropped on January 18th were 2,100 pounds of ground coffee, enough to provide every man in the garrison 3 cups. For soldiers who had been drinking melted snow flavored with cigarette ashes, who had not tasted real coffee in 18 days, the arrival of American coffee represented something beyond caffeination. It represented the continuity of civilization, the persistence of small comforts, the guarantee that the nation supporting them had resources to spare even for non-essential items in the middle of a siege. German soldiers in their positions, watching those supply drops, understood the symbolism too. They had not received real coffee in their rations for 2 years. Their coffee substitute was made from roasted acorns and chicory. Watching American planes drop actual coffee into a surrounded garrison, the German soldiers saw proof of the industrial gap they were fighting against. One German sergeant, captured 3 days later, told his American interrogators that the moment he saw the supply drop, he knew Germany would lose the war. Not because of the ammunition or the medical supplies, but because of the coffee. An army that can airdrop coffee to surrounded troops, he said, has already won. They are not fighting for survival. They are fighting with surplus. The actual 4th Armored Division reached Bastogne on January 19th, 72 hours after Hendrix's Phantom version had disrupted German plans. By that time, the tactical situation had transformed completely. The German assault that would have struck a depleted garrison on January 18th instead encountered a resupplied defensive position supported by clear weather air superiority. The Americans, who would have faced the assault with 12 artillery rounds per gun, instead had 400 rounds per gun. The wounded who would have died from infected wounds without sulfa drugs had been treated. The soldiers who would have fought on empty stomachs had been fed. And the German forces that would have, attacked with overwhelming concentration, had been dispersed across defensive positions waiting for American armor. That had already arrived in their imagination 72 hours before it arrived in reality. The Battle of Bastogne became a legend of American resilience, but the underlying truth was more complex and more revealing. American resilience was not spiritual. It was logistical. It was the knowledge, internalized by every American soldier, that the nation behind them would send supplies when they should not, would reach them when it was impossible, would waste resources on coffee because abundance permitted waste. The transformation this battle created operated at multiple levels simultaneously. At the tactical level, it demonstrated that information warfare could achieve effects that physical warfare could not. Hendrix's radio transmission, accomplished in 10 minutes what 3 weeks of combat had failed to achieve. It broke German operational initiative. At the strategic level, it confirmed Allied dominance in the intelligence war. American signals intelligence had penetrated German communications deeply enough to conduct real-time dissection operations using enemy encryption. At the psychological level, it reinforced the morale asymmetry between armies. American soldiers expected relief. German soldiers expected defeat. Those expectations shaped behavior more than tactical circumstances. But at the deepest level, the level that would outlast the specific battle and define the post-war order, it demonstrated the victory of abundance over scarcity as organizing principles for industrial civilization. The Americans won at Bastogne, not because their soldiers were braver German soldiers, fought with equal courage. Not because their tactics were superior German tactical doctrine, remained excellent. They won because their system produced surplus, and surplus produced options. And options produced victory. General George Patton, whose Third Army ultimately relieved Bastogne, understood this with unusual clarity. In his journal entry from January 20th, 1945, he wrote, "We did not rescue the 101st. The 101st was never in danger of surrender. They were in danger of casualties, but not surrender. American soldiers don't surrender when they know more supplies are coming. And more supplies are always coming. That is the difference between us and them. They fight until they run out. We fight until we win, because we never run out." Patton's observation captured the essential asymmetry. German operational planning was governed by resource constraints. American operational planning was governed by objective constraints. Germans asked, "What can we accomplish with what we have?" Americans asked, "What do we need to accomplish the objective?" The difference between those two questions defined the war's outcome more than any single battle. The radio equipment Hendricks used that night was in -300 Seychelles rupees. Nicknamed the walkie-talkie, though the backpack-mounted version was far larger than that nickname suggested. The -300 Seychelles rupees represented another asymmetry. American infantry companies carried radio equipment that provided voice communication over distances of 3 miles. German infantry companies relied on field telephones requiring physical wire connections. American battalion commanders could coordinate operations with subordinate units in real time. German battalion commanders often learned of tactical situations hours after they occurred, when runners arrived with written messages. This communications advantage multiplied the impact of American logistics. Superior supply systems, combined with superior communications, created tempo advantages that overwhelmed German operational planning. The radio lie that saved Bastogne was possible only because American communications technology allowed that lie to be transmitted with credibility and received with immediate impact. A German radio operator could not have executed the same deception in reverse because German equipment lacked the range and reliability to penetrate American communications networks at tactical level. The 600-men Hendricks' transmission most directly, saved with the casualties who would, have occurred in the German dawn assault planned for January 18th. American military analysts conducting post-battle assessment calculated that the planned German attack would have inflicted 400 to 800 American casualties in the first 6 hours based on ammunition expenditure rates, defensive positions, and German force concentration. By delaying that attack 72 hours until after American resupply and reinforcement, those casualties did not occur. The German assault that eventually came faced different circumstances and produced different outcomes. Casualty ratios shifted from an estimated 3 to 1 German favor to 2 to 1 American favor, a 5-fold change in combat effectiveness produced by logistics and deception rather than fighting. The men saved never knew they had been saved. They knew they had been resupplied. They knew German attacks had been lighter than expected, but the specific chain of causation remained classified for decades. Most of the soldiers who owed their lives to Hendricks' radio transmission died of old age never, knowing that their survival had originated in 10 minutes of electronic deception on January 17, 1945. Epilogue to this story extends far beyond Bastogne, beyond World War II, into the fundamental architecture of American military doctrine. The lesson internalized from this battle, and 1,000 others like it, was that information dominance and logistical superiority were inseparable and mutually reinforcing. American defense strategy for the next 80 years would be built on the assumption that knowledge and abundance were the twin pillars of military power. The radio networks became satellite networks. The supply drops became global logistics chains. The coffee became a symbol that persisted through every American military deployment. American soldiers expect hot food, climate-controlled sleeping quarters, internet access, and postal service, even in combat zones. This is not luxury. This is doctrine. It is the visible manifestation of the same principle that saved Bastogne. An army that can deliver coffee to a surrounded garrison is not fighting for survival. It is fighting with surplus. And surplus, properly employed, makes surrender unnecessary, retreat unthinkable, and victory inevitable. The German soldiers watching those supply drops in January 1945 understood what they were seeing. They were watching the future arrive by parachute, wrapped in white silk, carried by abundance, proving that the true weapon of war was not courage or tactics or even firepower, but the industrial capacity to provide everything, everywhere, always. That capacity meant freedom from scarcity, and freedom from scarcity meant freedom to act, and freedom to act meant victory. One radio lie, transmitted over 10 minutes, saved 600 men by reminding both sides of that fundamental